Podcast, your association's no fluff playbook to navigating and thriving in Industry 4.0 or the digital marketplace. Each week, we bring expert insights to help you and your association stay ahead of the curve.
Hello, my name is Sharon Rice, and I'm the Managing Director of Business Strategy for .org Source, an association consultancy. And today I'm your host for this episode of the Association 4.0 podcast. We're going to be talking about trust today. Trust has been in decline for a number of years. According to the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer, less than 50% of global survey respondents trust government leaders, religious leaders, journalists, or CEOs to do what is right. In addition, less than 50% of respondents find CEOs, non-governmental organization representatives, and boards of directors to be very or extremely credible sources of information about their organization. During this podcast, we're going to explore the decline of trust and how it's impacting associations, and also how we can restore trust in our work, our organizations, and our leaders. Tackling this issue with me is Bill Bruce. Bill is the CEO of the American Association of Nurse Anesthesiology. Bill joined AANA in 2022, having previously served as the CEO of the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine and the CTO of the American College of Orthopedic Surgeons. So, Bill, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Sharon. It's good to be here.
So when I was considering the topic of this podcast, I thought of you immediately because I know that building trust was a priority for you in your early work with ANA. Can you tell me a little bit about why you made building trust such a cornerstone of this beginning time as an association CEO?
Yeah, well, I think the big impetus for it was even during the onboarding process in this organization, I could perceive that there were the trust and lack of trust was something that had come up repeatedly in a number of avenues. And there's, it seems to be something that the whole organization has to deal with, both amongst board members to board members, previous iterations of the board to the current iteration of the board to probably the next iteration of the board, between the board and staff, from the CEO to staff, and even from all of us to our members individually. There have been examples where the lack of trust has definitely hurt the organization. And so for me, it's absolutely essential that we find a way to develop a new culture of trust within the organization and the profession if we're going to survive and be successful collectively. And that's why we started this way. And for me, trust, it can only start at the top. It has its source at the top. If there is no trust at the president and board and CEO level of an organization, then there's going to be no trust beneath that. And that will cascade out all the way down to everyday members, to the lowest staff. And it will hurt the organization if you don't have it.
So if we think about it kind of from multiple perspectives, you're talking about really, trust between your members in the organization, trust between your staff and you as the CEO, trust between you and the board of directors. It's multifaceted. And it was interesting when I was reading the surveys, one of the things that stood out to me, even in that Edelman trust barometer, was that today employees are likely to put more trust in the companies that they work for than other organizations, making it seem like the closer you are to that source of information, the more likely you are to believe it and to have, kind of faith in it. Does that make sense to you? It's like all politics is local. Is it become the case that all trust is local?
Yeah, well, I think there's a certain, it makes perfect sense to me. I think this is in line with sort of the bubble theory of social interactions that we see, and you tend to have a stronger affinity for the people that you're closer to. online and in the real world. And so part of that is you are closer to witnessing the experiences of those people, and that gives you a little bit of a bias towards favoring them. And it's easy to develop more trust with more exposure. You have more experience with individuals that are nearer, and workplaces are absolutely one of those things where it can be a stronger source of trust. That all gets down to the behaviors of individual environments and what the culture is within those environments, and the history of credibility that may or may not exist. All of those will color that to sort of the opportunity to develop a strong sense of trust with a closer community, however you're defining that, is absolutely there. And it's something that I do see.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me. I'm doing a lot of work right now looking at, I would say, the decline of membership, even, within physician-based organizations or clinical societies, medical societies. And we tend to kind of lay that at a generation's feet to say that, for example, millennials are less likely in some way to join the professional association than certainly the baby boomer counterparts that are now, for the most part, out of the workforce, almost entirely out of the workforce. And as I started looking at trust, I also started kind of trying to think, is the disinclination to belong to an association, is that really generational? And is it a coincidence that we've been seeing the steady decline of trust throughout the millennials kind of experience? Is there a trust factor here that's making it difficult for us to recruit and retain younger members of associations?
That's an interesting perspective. And as you were setting that up, I was thinking about this. And for those who don't know me, I'm very obviously a Gen Xer, and so I've spent a good number of years now straddling this, the perceptions of the boomer generation with millennials and those come sense, and so I think it's tempting to lay accountability at the feet of generational differences here. I think there are patterns that are common from the perspectives of these different generations that do influence an individual's propensity to join an organization. They're looking for different things, and certainly for some, and this is one of the things that I've had to deal with in my current role and my past role, and it's not uncommon that others in CEO roles for associations are struggling with this right now. Is you have your wiser, more seasoned members who've been around for decades. They value a completely different set of things typically in membership than newer members. And the thing that I find myself attempting to do is finding a way to balance the expectations and needs and desires of our former presidents, of people who are decades long members who love and built an organization that was very close to them. And unfortunately, sometimes they want things that are diametrically opposed to what our younger members say they want in an organization. And balancing these two different things means that at some point you have to make a choice of picking one over the other. And so you risk losing the engagement and loyalty of lifelong members who are probably now some of your biggest foundation contribution sources. If you have a PAC, they're probably the most involved in the PAC on a pound for pound by the dollars standpoint. But if you're starting to see the member acquisition and retention of newer people coming into the profession beginning to suffer, it's likely that everything that you have may be misaligned with what their expectations are. And part of that might be attributable to differences in generations. And I think, I have people who I've worked with over the years that I think are not appropriately classified by generation. I think mindsets are independent of age, and I've always known this to be true. I've had folks working for me going back as far as 20 years that were septuagenarians that ran complicated SQL marriage exercises to generate reports, and pulling tables together from different sources, helping with data models and stuff. And then you'd walk down the hall to somebody who's in their late 40s and then say, I'm too old to understand this computer stuff. So it's a mindset more than an age related thing, but it's a mindset that tends to be associated with age and generation, just because there tends to be more commonalities there. So I think getting back to the real question, and the trust side of it with the younger members, there's certainly going to be an element of younger members entering professions that lack an amount of trust because of the famed feud between millennials and boomers. that Gen Xers like myself have utterly failed at mitigating and managing the expectations of so far. And in a way, it's kind of amusing that this is kind of a thing in our culture, but it's there. I mean, there's going to be some of that, but I think to give that too much credit as a root cause would be dangerous. I think really the thing to understand is, what are the differences in perspectives that is really underneath these emotions? There might be you get that first impression of an organization if you're entering into a career, and your first impression might be that this is an organization that is rooted in a bygone era, that you see the profession changing. And there may be truth in that, there may not be, depending on the organization and the profession. And the real challenge is making sure that you go out of your way to learn the real root causes. What is causing that misperception or perception, and how, if at all, do you currently want to address it, so that you could change that first impression as people come in and recapture them and have them be part of the workforce. I believe you could be any age and develop a lifelong commitment to an organization. The things that drive to that result, I think, are just different today than they were 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting when I think about, perceptions, and as you're talking, so I have a millennial daughter, and I would say in general, she doesn't quite trust as easily as I do. And then it comes down to, in some ways, that nature versus nurture argument. Like, do we start from a position of trust and then trust is lost, or do we have to earn trust? I think there's different, kind of philosophies on that. Trust was at its highest during the Eisenhower administration in public institutions, and I was born during the Eisenhower administration. So I think that I was a part of a society in my, kind of my early days that was more trusting in general. I had more faith in institutions, and that trust continued to decline over my lifetime. But if the nurture argument is valid in any way, I was kind of nurtured in trust as I was coming up. Then I think about, my daughter was in college during 9/11, and she actually was still in college and in graduate school during the recession. But I had a millennial board member point out to me over the weekend that if you just kind of track the career history, or what millennials were experiencing from an economic perspective during their early career, stages, and a kind of a lack of security in general, that it makes sense that maybe they're more kind of wary of their professional associations. And I think the other thing that's also true about millennials, especially when we think about sources of information, in the heyday of associations, which I would put in the, kind of in the 70s and into the 80s, when we were seeing a lot of certification programs emerge in professional societies, and joining, was the thing you did. You supported your association. There were very limited sources of information about, the practice, if you will. So the association was kind of automatically that trusted source of information and education about the association. Now, we have so many different sources of information that I don't know, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this, but I don't know that associations hold that same kind of privileged position from a dispensing information, credible information, that they held when there was less competition for providing that same information.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, there's associations. Every association that I've been involved with has, at one point or another, tried to carry the label of we're the voice of profession XYZ, and it was, and there could be any number of things that might mean, and what has happened to a number of organizations who held that is, time has sort of taken that away from them, because everybody in that heyday in the 70s and 80s established themselves as an authority, and forgot to think that anybody might ever challenge that authority. And particularly, some professions are more susceptible than others. Some professions might just naturally be less organized and less cohesive and less society minded, less of a collective than others. And those organizations, particularly, you could have individuals in the profession that can aggregate or individually into new sources of information. And I've seen a number of places where members of an organization can challenge the credibility of the entire organization, because they end up gaining their own audience and platform, because they've been more proficient at utilizing modern technologies and platforms to do that. That's there are people in recent organizations that I've been with that have access to audiences that are on par with the organization itself, and might not always agree with the organization's strict interpretation of any specific issue. And so I think there's certainly an opportunity there for the role of the association to be legitimately challenged by a small number of people who may or may not be really good at developing these thoughts or ideas or directives. And sometimes these could be the brightest people in an organization. At times, they can also be the most social media savvy in an organization, and those might not be congruent statements. They might be, in fact, not the same people that have both of those characteristics. And so I think there's an opportunity for organizations to remember to be nimble in this, and there's kind of a lesson here. And the real question is, what do you do if you find yourself in one of these many organizations that has lost a little bit of its shine in the eyes of those in the profession, because there are other sources that you might say are just as credible or differently credible or have a different perspective. How do you evolve into something that can regain that position, and then make sure that you are near the center of that mindset moving forward? That can be very hard depending on the organization.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you bring up this concept of influencer. A lot of times we'll see, let's say, professional influencers who have amassed a large audience, as you say, that is comparable to the membership of an association. a lot of times they've amassed that audience by virtue of their relationship to the association, right? They may have held a position in the association, and anybody that's tried to build a LinkedIn network, for example, knows it's super easy to be able to just, send out these invitations and just grab people from association LinkedIn sites or whatnot. So they amass that, and then they become, by virtue of the fact that people are connected to them and watching them, they become influencers. And yet the level of vetting of information is very different from a professional association. However, their information tends to be more immediate. And so there's a sense of, I'm thinking this is true, but challenge me on this if you don't, that to a certain extent, immediacy of delivery of content it creates an authority. In essence, if somebody can, get out there often and fast, whereas the association might be releasing information in a more kind of conservative manner, that fast and out there person gains credibility because of the delivery.
I think, I would not disagree with that at all. There's absolutely something that has happened. And I actually think this hurts trust. But unfortunately, what happens is our current very influencer-driven approach to any, pick a topic, anything. You could find this from what hammer should I buy to who should I vote for president. Everything in the middle. You have somebody talking about it. And for people who have not been disciplined in how they curate their connections, in any network or in real life, it's really easy to surround yourself with a bubble of people who think the same way or want to believe the same things you believe, and that makes it very hard to remember to consider the trustworthiness or the accuracy of information you hear, and it makes it very tempting to latch onto the first thing that agrees with something that is comfortable to your mind's preconceptions. On either any side of any issue, this is going to happen. And I've watched it happen to people. And individuals who tend to be very good at using social media or any other platform tend to be very good at presenting an idea that in a particular light that agrees with their philosophy or their view of a thing, and the people who latch onto that are very comfortable with that. And then there's another group of people that kind of maybe are put off by it because they could see that there's something about it that doesn't quite add up. And by the time you can validate that what's right and what's wrong, the perception's already been out there about the wrong information. And so associations being more conservative, I think the challenge, the trust challenge there is it's hard to trust that you're going to get timely information from an association. You might be able to trust that you're going to get accurate information from an association, but that's going to depend on your perspective on those issues. You might have a bias towards somebody who's more on the fringe of an idea. And I guess conversely, I don't know of any examples of this personally, but you might be in an organization that is itself more on the fringe of a set of information or knowledge, and be the ones that are doing this. But I think if you're looking at that influencer effect, the people who could get information, especially those who could get very quick, passionate information out about a thing, tend to be the ones that set the perspective of a group on that issue more completely, even if that information is incorrect. And in the end, it's going to be what drives different facets of any issue apart from each other, because some will have stopped thinking about an issue and not be willing to revisit it and assume that their side of an argument has been correct in perpetuity, and others will never forget that they were wrong at some point. And so it really does. It will drive to I think the further disintegration of social constructs around opinions of things.
It's really interesting. And I think that, I guess two things. One is that our confirmation bias, whether we're out there kind of looking for those influencers that think the way that we think, or maybe the influencers are shaping the way we think and we like it, we feel good about that, means that we're less concerned in some ways about the accuracy of the information that we're getting. We don't hold that at, kind of the premium that we used to.
Right.
And, I hope that that's something that's cyclical, that we'll start to see a change in that. But I think we're just continuing to double down on that effect, that we're seeking out information that conforms to our perspectives already, that just validates our perspectives, and kind of latching on to people who share opinions, as opposed to being able to kind of seek out a diversity of opinions and kind of become smarter in the process of doing that. When we think about associations, though, do certifying bodies still have kind of a leg up in this regard, that they're setting standards and then they're, kind of validating the understanding of the people that they're certifying, or the performance of the people that they're certifying, and that those standards from a certification perspective still hold a lot of clout from a trust perspective?
Well, everybody who works for a certification board would say absolutely. That is the case. I think it's indeterminate. I think they probably are. My impression, my personal impression, is that is probably still the case. And I'll share that I have full awareness that in every organization I've been involved with, there are a great many individuals who are diplomates or certificants or certified by whatever board it's been, who are deeply dissatisfied with the certification process on any number of levels. And that could be the initial certification, the maintenance of certification, fear for what a lot of certifying boards are doing now, which is moving away from high stakes exams every 5, 10, 8, 4, however many years, right, to more of a longitudinal assessment approach. All of this, there's a lot of consternation around that. But I think taking a step back and looking at how these are all approached, I think certifying boards generally do deserve credibility and trust, at least in terms of what they say that they do. And I could speak to that from the medical perspective, because I've had experience working now with boards in 4 different areas of medicine, and I have found that the individuals involved with creating the content and managing the body of knowledge, while sometimes they could be frustratingly slow to adapt to the contemporary practice and how it's evolving. So because practice in some areas of medicine, practice moves way faster than boards are ever going to be able to. And so they have to have catch-up years, and that might challenge their credibility at certain points, the amount you could trust the quality. But I also am a huge believer in the value of academic discipline, which all of the boards I've worked with, I've seen that in practice. They really do a great job of ensuring that what they are certifying, you could take it to the bank, for the most part. And it's been a long time since I've heard of, and the certification itself being the bone of contention in any liability cases in medical practice. It's always something else, and that's really where you go. The lawyers are the ones that are saying you are or are not compliant with the standards set by a certifying body. And that's how lawyers and actuaries will assign liability. And that tells us all a lot about this, because those are the ones taking it to the bank.
Yeah. And it's when we get a certification, when we're certified, that's in some ways like a badge of trustworthiness. That certification, that credential, communicates something to our employers or, to other people that are interacting with us, that, theoretically helps to improve trust in what we're doing. So it is interesting, although in the future, will that still be true? Will certification still communicate trustworthiness? or will that kind of crumble along with, kind of other institutional trust challenges? So, it is interesting. I think, when we think about trust, kind of going back and building trust, and you've been tackling it at a number of different layers. How do you take on the trust issue, let's say, that might exist between members and an association versus trust, issues that may be related to staff and an employer? How do you tackle, the many to one relationship when building trust?
Well, I think, one, you have to approach it with the understanding that it's going to take time.
Mhm.
And trust. There are a few people out here. My wife is one of the people who, when she meets people, they start at a 100, and experience may bring them down. And I'm hopeful that I'm still in the 90s with her after 35 years. Then there are others that then I tend to be more the opposite of my default is you start with 0 and you're in your way up. But either way, you end up with you need history to change the initial assessment or the current assessment, and history needs to involve transparency, honesty, and reliability. If you could do those things, then you will be trusted for good reasons.
And can I add consistency to that then too? To that list?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, I would. Yeah, I would say that we're saying the same thing. Yes. You need to be able to tell people to the most complete extent that is reasonable what you're going to do. And then you need to do what you said you were going to do without surprises. And then you need to make sure you listen to how that is received and then do it all over again and repeat it. And when you have done that, and as long as the audience, the members in this case, can connect collectively, not individually, but collectively, what they want from the organization in this case to what the organization is doing, and whether or not it's successful is less important than it's trying and it's working in a direction. But as long as the organization can show that it's aware of what the community of its members needs and is acting in the collective best interests of that community, and showing them along the way that that's really why they exist, then trust will develop over time. There is no quick way to do it. You have to, if an organization has found itself where it's made, I know some organizations who've made business deals that have called into question the fundamental credibility of the organization to its members. And unfortunately, there's no real way to recover lost trust from something like that. Particularly if the membership of an organization feels that the board and the senior staff or whoever was involved in the decision-making process did not disclose or had some personal benefit, or that the result of this may have been not in the best interest of the larger part of the collective. All of those things can be very disruptive to an organization, which I think are the biggest reasons that organizations might lose trust quickly. The other thing that might happen is if you don't see that the organization is acting in the interests of the collective appropriately, then you'll have less engagement and increased apathy. And as apathy sinks in, it develops into not really mistrust, but a lack of trust. And you don't trust things that you don't have some emotion towards. The presence of actual trust implies some amount of investment in that relationship. And so if you don't have that investment, you're never going to have trust. And so I would say that you have to tie engagement and the relationship, the overall relationship with members is essential here to achieve it. And yeah, so I think as long as you have that kind of perspective towards trust is something that is it's ethereal, but it's also hard as a rock, and it can change from one to the other in a single interaction, and sometimes it can't change from one to the other in 1,000 interactions. It really does depend on individuals and the way that you comport yourself. Yeah, but I mean, it's an interesting challenge. I mean, we're in my current organization. I said, I want to revisit what I said at the beginning, because I may have implied that there's all of these problems everywhere. We're a great organization. We have wonderful members. And one of the things that I can say has definitely held us back as an organization is there have been earned trust challenges in specific situations. And so one of the things that we, when we worked earlier in the year, it was to begin to establish a norm among our leadership that you can build trust on. It was to explore how our board itself needed to comport in the conduction of its business over the course of its term in a way that would engender trust and confidence amongst members. And for the most part, the feedback we have received as a result of those efforts has been very positive. I've seen that actually work. I've seen the way that our board communicates evolve, and it's a process. You have to develop. Changing culture is not something you decide to do. It's something you show you can do, and it takes time. And in a way, that's really what we're doing. Is we have to have a culture that where trust is important and it is sought out and nurtured.
Yeah, I think that trust is one of those core cultural values we see a lot. Just how do we really live that, becomes somewhat of an issue. And, going back to this concept of engagement and trust, it's an interesting relationship, right? Because that concept of all trust is local doesn't necessarily mean that we know the people that we're trusting. So I'm thinking about association members who trust the organization, but engagement is likely to increase trust as long as we're exhibiting trustworthy behaviors, right? That interaction between members and the association is likely to build trust if the association values trust, understands trust, and exhibits those trusting behaviors. Back to the organization, we talked about transparency, being one, and it is interesting when we think about boards to members. I was working with a board this weekend that I've worked with over the course of a number of years, and they do really good work that their members know nothing about. Right. Because boards aren't used to necessarily kind of tooting their own horns. They're there to serve. People are aware of who's on the board. They're not necessarily aware of, all of the conversations and interactions that they're having. And I thought it was interesting because I was saying to them, you need to be, kind of more transparent to your members, not because they were holding back, but because they almost didn't want the attention of, saying, hey, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. You do kind of need to have a little bit of show personship in this. You need to be willing to be out and in front of an audience and demonstrating the value. And that might feel a bit like you're bragging or you're, I can see why that might be difficult for some people. I've been fortunate that the board people on the boards of the organizations I've been with have not suffered from this
Okay.
shyness. um, but I have a little bit of it myself, and so
Yeah.
I could certainly empathize for those that might find themselves in the situation where you need to encourage your board member to actually take more credit
Yeah.
and talk more about the things that they've done that have helped the organization, or let the organization highlight them. One thing that we try to do is in my last organization for sure, is highlight the successes of not just our board, but different significant members, and sometimes not well-known members, but find stories specifically that you see a member doing the right thing and doing it well, and give them the attention for that. And one, you show that you celebrate the things that are valuable to the organization, and that helps. And you might get the benefit of developing or furthering the potential of a current or future leader of the organization in the process. So you build loyalty when you do this too.
Yeah, I think, in general, as people, we're very literary in the sense that we're interested in people's stories. And when the association highlights members that have a story to tell, and that they would not otherwise, the other members of the association wouldn't otherwise know that story, it's very powerful, because it then also connects you to the organization. In a way, you're reading that story and you're saying, yes, and I'm a member of the same organization. And you develop that sense of pride, which I think is really important too. So kind of as a final thought, tell me, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of associations from a trust perspective with our members?
Oh, I'm unsure. To me, if I really think about it, it's hard. I'm optimistic. I think there's definitely an opportunity for us to move past this. The trick is going to be, at least I think for the organizations that I've been involved with, separating the influence of trust on a broader social level, and separating that from the trust that people have for their own professional organization. I think that needs to be a place where associations capitalize on an opportunity to be a credible, trusted source for their audience, and show that it can do things, knowing that it's never going to be perfect, and depending on issues, you're going to have split audiences and different issues, and you have to be careful about how to navigate that. But I think that there's a real opportunity for associations to demonstrate their worthiness of trust by advocating for a neutral slate of standards, of improvements, of advocacy initiatives, of any number of things that is for the betterment of the profession of those that are their members. And so I think it's, for most organizations, it's their game to lose at this point. They just need to, they can maintain it. The generational divide is something that's going to be very real, and the tricky part is going to be having a transition that allows them to bring in younger members while not completely disenfranchising the ones who've been around for decades. And so you're going to be trading trust in that scenario, I think, is the inevitable future. Or you're going to see new organizations born that have a slightly different perspective, and will eventually replace existing organizations. There may be some examples of that already happening in some industries. And so yeah, while I think that things that support trust socially are going to face an increasing number of challenges. there is an opportunity for associations to be a beacon in what is a darker time for trust. And so I'll be optimistic on this. I think if I narrow the lens down to associations alone, I will say I am optimistic. I think there's a real chance that we can do it. I have to, otherwise there's no point in me coming to work. So broader society things, it's going to be harder. It's ironic because from a distance, you mentioned earlier the trust in institutions being higher back in Eisenhower's. I think that I would agree with that, is that the trust in institutions is far lower today than when I was younger. And I think that what's been interesting for me is even for me, who I try to be very aware of these things, and I try to not just sort of take on different things, but I've also recognized that there have been times in my life where I've been harsh and the bias I've applied towards people who would choose to work for the government, for instance, in any agency. And one of the things that I'm very grateful for is the work I've done in my past 3 organizations has afforded me the opportunity to get to know people who I would say are bureaucrats who work in agencies, who would be those probably the people sitting in the cubicle that you think of as your average government employee. And almost without exception, and across many different agencies of government, I have not failed to be just wonderfully impressed with the quality of intellect and capabilities of the people who choose to work in these roles. And it really got to the point where I was like, well, we may not like what public institutions do as a whole entity, but we probably have misplaced frustrations onto the workforce of those institutions and made assumptions about the quality of the people in those workforces. Because I can tell you, I've worked with people in the VA and the Health Resources Services Administration and the DoD and NIOSH and OSHA, on Capitol Hill and NASA. And these are some of the smartest human beings I know. And they not only know the details in and out of their professions, but they understand how that applies to the regulatory and governmental aspects that lay on top of it. And that's the part where, I think even the smartest of us, our heads would explode if we had to look at the way you can accomplish things that from a professional perspective within a government construct. That part is very hard, and I could not do those jobs. I really admire them. And I've spent some time recently sort of thinking I've been a little bit harsh in my lack of faith, at least in the workforce of government. And once you get away from the politics side of it, just doing the work, these folks are fantastic. We should have more faith in these institutions and in their spirit. And I see that also with the absolute frustration of the confusing nature of the messaging we got out of the CDC for the past 3 years. Which I think is an exception and really a tragic, unfortunate event. That they failed to rise to the challenge of addressing the nuance of information as it evolved, and that hurt their credibility, and I think deservedly so.
Well, and a lot of these folks are our members too, in different associations that we're working with. And I even think you could extend what you're saying, with government, people that work in bureaucracies or in government agencies to even our healthcare workforce, where there's been a decline in trust, even, with our healthcare workers. And you look at the amount of violence that we're seeing, for example, in hospital settings right now, that the decline of trust impacts our members in a very real way too. And I think, just in summary, what I've learned from you both, in working with you, but also in talking with you today, is that addressing, trust issues from a very intentional perspective. So not just assuming, that everybody trusts you, but really taking a look at it and then, trying to figure out how do we how do we maintain or how do we improve trust with our various constituencies is absolutely important right now, because we obviously can't take that trust for granted at this stage in our history, or it's a mistake, let's say, to take it for granted at this stage. So, Bill, thank you so much for your time and your insights today. If people would like to continue the conversation with you, how can they get a hold of you?
That's a great question. I think the best way to get a hold of me is probably either through my profile on LinkedIn, or they can reach out to me at my work email. It's just bill@aana.com. If they want to reach out, that's fine. I'd be happy to have more conversations about this.
Well, that's great. And thanks to all of our listeners as well. If you'd like to meet more leaders like Bill Bruce, then I'd like to encourage you to consider joining .org Community. .org Community connects you to a vibrant network of association executives and partners. And to learn more about .org Community, just go to orgcommunity.com. Thanks again, Bill. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Sharon.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode and discovered tips and information that will add value to your leadership style and your association. .org Source specializes in positioning teams for success with solutions for technology, strategy, and marketing. Please contact us at info@orgsource.com or visit www.orgsource.com to find out how to keep your organization on track to Association 4.0.